You are welcome to yet another episode of HN What's Your Say? The #1 listening show, where we discuss real issues with real people like you. We are still featuring R. Kelly. Real name Robert Sylvester Kelly. Also known as the R&B King. In this country, laws have always been painted as the great equalizer. Blind to race, background or fame. But time and again, the legal system has betrayed that promise, especially when it comes to black excellence. Two laws stand out not just for their language, but for how they've been weaponized, the Mann Act and the RICO Act. These laws have not been blind. Instead, they have often served as calculated tools of white supremacy. And to understand how they've been used against black celebrities like R. Kelly, we must first look back to the first major victim of the Mann Act, Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson wasn't just any boxer. He was the first black heavyweight boxing champion of the world, a title he won in 1908. In a deeply segregated America, that victory alone was an act of rebellion. Jack Johnson didn't just fight his opponents in the ring. He challenged the very idea of white dominance. He refused to conform. He dated white women openly, drove expensive cars, wore fine clothes and carried himself like a king in a world that had always told black men to bow and looked at them as slaves. White America couldn't handle it and so they waited. In 1910, the Mann Act was enacted supposedly to combat immoral acts like prostitution. But its vague language criminalizing the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes gave the government a weapon. 2 years later in 1912, that weapon was drawn against Jack Johnson. His crime? Traveling with a white woman he was in a relationship with from one state to another. Think about that. White men were always doing the same thing. Traveling, dating, sleeping with women across state lines, but they weren't charged. Only Jack Johnson was. His relationship was reframed as sex trafficking. He was painted not as a champion but as a criminal. And the government, using the Mann Act, tore his legacy apart. He was forced into exile, living in Europe for years before eventually returning to face arrest and imprisonment. A man who once ruled the boxing world was now a fugitive for daring to live and love outside the boundaries of white supremacy. By the time he met his demise in a car crash in 1946, his career had long been buried by a law designed not to protect but to punish. Fast forward nearly a century later and the playbook hasn't changed. The Mann Act returned, this time not for Jack Johnson but for R. Kelly. And once again, a successful black man who had reached the pinnacle of his career was put on trial not just in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion. And just like Jack Johnson, the language of the Mann Act was twisted, distorted and ultimately weaponized against him. Now let's be clear. The Mann Act was written in 1910. That's over a century ago. The very foundations of the law were built in an era of lynchings, segregation and outright racial terror. It was passed during a time when interracial relationships were seen as abominations by the state. And yet instead of repealing or replacing this law, the government continues to breathe life into it when it suits their agenda. In R. Kelly's case, for example, they didn't accuse him of kidnapping. They didn't accuse him of holding anyone against their will. Instead, they used the Mann Act's vague wording about transportation for immoral purposes to criminalize basic consensual travel between adults. Travel for shows. Travel to see loved ones. Travel that millions of Americans, black or white, do every day. If R. Kelly had been a white artist, would the government have even bothered with the Mann Act? Or is this law resurrected only when they need to make an example out of a black man? Let's also not ignore the glaring contrast. We have never seen high-profile white men like Jeffrey Epstein or Harvey Weinstein taken down using the Mann Act or RICO Act. Likewise, former Fox News boss Roger Ailes, who may have also had his staff organize his meetings and lunches where he met with the alleged victims. Jeffrey Epstein ran a full-fledged child trafficking ring. He flew minors across international borders. He had an entire private island where abuse allegedly took place. And yet no RICO charges. No Mann Act indictment. Nothing. Harvey Weinstein was accused by dozens of women, actresses, assistants and interns of sexual abuse and harassment spanning decades. Yet no federal racketeering and no Mann Act used. Now compare that to R. Kelly's matter. The government constructed a narrative that he led a criminal enterprise. The exact language used to invoke the RICO Act. But how exactly is an artist, surrounded by employees who depend on his music, suddenly the head of an illegal organization? The RICO Act, which was originally passed in 1970 to dismantle the mafia, was never intended for individuals. It was created to take down large-scale criminal enterprises like drug cartels and mob families. It requires an ongoing organization with a clear structure and pattern of criminal behavior. But over the years, prosecutors have learned how to stretch its definition. And too often, they stretch it when the target is black. RICO now gets thrown around not to target criminal empires, but to paint black artists as gang leaders simply for having entourages. They call it enterprise. We call it a team. They call it pattern of behavior. We call it life. So what does it say when Weinstein, Epstein and other powerful white men are never labeled with RICO, but R. Kelly and later Sean Diddy Combs are? This isn't law enforcement. It's enforcement of a racial hierarchy. When you zoom out, the picture becomes chillingly clear. Two laws born in two different centuries but with one common thread: they were forged, molded and used to uphold white dominance. To remind black men that no matter how high you climb, there is always a trapdoor beneath your feet. For Jack Johnson, that trapdoor was the Mann Act. For R. Kelly, it was both the Mann Act and RICO. And here's the most brutal part. Once these laws are applied, the stain never fades. Careers end, legacies are rewritten. The media and public never stop to ask, was the law applied fairly? They just assume guilt. They see a black man in court and they remember what the system wants them to remember. That black success must be monitored, managed and if necessary dismantled. R. Kelly may have been flawed like any other man. But flawed doesn't mean criminal. And flawed certainly doesn't justify the deployment of laws born from racism and used to enforce it. This is no longer just about R. Kelly's guilt or innocence. This is about a system that reaches back to 1910 and 1970, dragging forward laws with racist intent and applying them in modern times to fulfill the same old mission, which is to tear down black men who dare to succeed. Jack Johnson fought with his fists, R. Kelly fought with his voice. But both stood tall in arenas they were never meant to win in and both paid the price. So when we talk about justice, let's talk about the laws. Let's talk about the Mann Act written to stop interracial relationships under the guise of morality. Let's talk about RICO crafted to crush mafia syndicates, but now redirected toward successful black artists. Let's talk about how these laws have never been blind. Let's talk about how justice in our country still has a color. Because this isn't just about one man's downfall. It's about the fallacy of a system that claims to be fair while waging an open war on black greatness. That is all we had for you today on HN What's Your Say? To keep updated whenever we post a new video, subscribe to this channel now. Also remember to hit the bell icon and enable notifications. And feel free to share your opinions with us in the comment section below, and let us know if you would like us to publish your views in our next release. We value all our subscribers' opinions.